while back, my stepmother, Dolores Morgan Evans, happened to mention that in 1944, when she was a young girl of 13, a B-17 bomber flew over her house and crashed in their field only a mile or so from her parents' farm east of Agar, South Dakota. To say that the crash interested me would be an understatement. I wanted to know more, lots more. COVID-19 was soon on a rampage, but I asked Dolores if I could interview her, with the understanding that we'd sit outside, keeping a proper distance to avoid any risk. She agreed, so we checked our calendars and the forecast, and we met on the first free, non-windy day we could find, September 10th, 2020. And so her story began. What year is that the best that you can?
1944.
Well, it was 1944. In the summer or?
It was in the winter. I thought it was in the summer, but it was in the winter. It was in January.
Okay.
Yeah, and I knew that because I brought out my diary that I started as a 7th grader, 8th grader in 1944. And I got to reading it the other day. So then I had to call Larry, my brother. And he said, yeah, it was in January. I don't remember any snow being on the ground at that time or anything. And but anyway, Larry verified, yes. So my diary was right.
Okay.
They had the soldiers from Pier were guarding the plane.
Okay.
And then they came and ate at our house. One shift, it was they had a shift going 24 hours a day, watching the plane. And so when they got done with their morning shift, my mother, of course, would invite them up to our home and serve breakfast. And I'm sure it was the works, the pancakes, the eggs, the bacon, the whole gamut, you know. So anyway, she knew how to cook. But my brother Larry could tell you more because he was more fascinated by the by the workings of the plane than what was there and what wasn't there and stuff.
Now, once COVID eased its grip and we were all vaccinated, Dolores, her son Bradley, and I headed out nearly a year later, September 5th, 2021, to meet Larry Venner in Agar.
The wheels made a section line.
The first item of business was story time in a parking lot.
I remember when I first learned how to ride the bike. And
Then it was story time in a local eating establishment.
Yeah, Millie's Diner.
I never heard of it.
7 days a week. Wow.
Last name is Fulton. She's a strong Catholic.
Followed by story time where Dolores and Larry's family lived before moving to the farm.
Andy Frost.
Now, I'm going to tell you a story, but I don't want it in your documentary.
Oh.
Our barns were right here. Where all this green is where the dairy was. And that house straight across there was A.A. Thompson's house. Their son was one of my best friends. He was a year younger than me. And we played together all the time, and we had hogs here. And about where that tree, well, in that low spot right in there, that was a hog wallow. And Jimmy and I were out here one day. It was just hotter than hell. And I think Jimmy suggested it.
My apologies, but I must honor Larry's request that this story not be part of the documentary. So I'm afraid you'll have to ask him for the ending. Yeah, I know, it hurts, doesn't it? Anyway, on with the B-17 story.
We've never ever told our story, but my mother always listened to every plane that went over. She always looked, and she was out of the kitchen window. And I remember just like sitting here today, she looked out the window. That plane was so high you could hardly see it. But she said, "Oh, look, Lawrence, they're throwing out advertisements." That was the parachutes coming out. And we went outside, and Dad said to Mom, "Parachutes hell." He says, "They're coming down. That engine's on fire." And that never left our sight as it made its circle 8 around. And when that plane came over our farm, Dad was trying to put gas in the 40 Chevy in order to get out of there because he was afraid he was going to start a prairie fire or something. And that plane was so low, it was just reached up right over my head, maybe 100 feet, 200 feet, but it spewed oil on our windshield of the old car sitting there, right under it. And it made one more loop out. And at that time, the pilot and the co-pilot had jumped out over shops. They had jumped out, and the two of them were, the plane was real low, and one of them hurt his ankle pretty bad coming down. But that plane didn't have anybody in it that last round when it came over our house, and then it made one more turn and then crashed in our pasture a quarter of a mile from the house. It just missed our fence, cut the telephone line. Dad tried to call the fire department, no fire, no telephone. We drove around the plane. The shells were going off. It was all afire. Nobody was there. We drove around it on Heasley's pasture there, and Dad said, "This is no place for us. Let's go pick up a couple of guys." So we went over east of Fairviews on Lytle's land and picked up two of them. And the one guy was the first one to bail out. The oxygen was so thin that he passed out, and when he hit the ground, he went right into the dirt, and his buddy stayed with him. Those were the two we picked up. Put the chutes in our trunk of our old 40 Chevy, and anyway, the one guy, Dolores and my mother and Dad, they were in the front seat. I was in the back seat with those two guys. The one guy was a pretty big guy, the one that went facing the dirt, and his buddy was on the other side, and I'm sitting between them. And anyway, he had a concussion of sorts because he threw up all over the back seat. But we got him back to where the plane was burning, and by then the MPs got there.
So how old were you then?
Yeah, at that time I was in grade school. Yeah. Because I rode horseback to school, so everybody had to ride horseback by the plane.
No bombs.
So even the parachutes that we had in the trunk of our car, we had to give those up. And went around and asked everybody what they had, and so.
I had some parts out of engine motor that were like, I'm thinking they were some type of electrical device, like a magneto or something. They were circled and had lots of different wires would have been connected to them that would have tore out of those engines at some point, and they're being tossed out and rolled down the field. In fact, I even crawled, the guard let me crawl in the tail gunner's seat in there and sat in that position. They'd removed the gun by then, but
Eventually, then the crew from Pier came out and took them back to Pier. But come to find out, we thought maybe they were local boys from the Pier with having this bombing practice. Well, they weren't. We found out much later that they were on their way to Europe. And they were in a B-17 bomber. And then we kept track of some of those boys, especially the two that we picked up. And my mom wrote letters to them down through the war. I wrote letters to them. And then later on, after the war was over, and the one boy was killed in action, and when his remains and his belongings came home, his mother found our letters. And so she wrote to us. And I think I possibly have that letter yet that Mom passed on to me. And but anyway, she told us that he had been killed in action, and I'm not sure, I don't know if the letter says how, I don't know that, I don't remember that. And but anyway, it was interesting to know, what did happen to them and whatever. But anyway, it was pretty fascinating, and never forget it. And my dad said that had he known that when that plane came over that it was on automatic pilot and that there wasn't somebody behind it that was guiding it down, because he'd been much more frightened as to where it was going to be landing and stuff.